The snow came early that year. By the third week of November, the Bitterroot Valley in Montana Territory had already seen two hard freezes. The kind that cracked axe handles left outside overnight and turned the mud between cabins into a corrugated iron floor that rang under boot heels like frozen stone. Old-timers at the trading post in Stevensville shook their heads and said they hadn't seen a sky that low, that gray, since the winter of '62. The kind of winter, they said, that didn't ask permission. Along the eastern ridgeline of the valley, where the ponderosa pines thinned and the wind came down off the Sapphire Mountains without anything to slow it, most homesteaders were still packing mud into the gaps between their log walls, still laying in firewood, still hoping. But one man on that ridge wasn't hoping. He had been ready since September, and the cabin he'd built to get himself through was unlike anything the valley had ever seen. 8 walls instead of 4, stone instead of timber, a central firebox positioned not against a wall, but at the very heart of the structure, radiating outward in every direction like the hub of a wheel. From the outside, it looked like something between a fortress and a folly. Too short to be a tower, too round to be a proper cabin, too deliberate to be an accident. People had laughed at it all summer long. By February, no one was laughing. If you've ever wondered what the people who built this country understood about surviving cold that we've completely forgotten, you're in the right place. This channel is dedicated to the real engineering of the frontier, the solutions that worked when failure meant death, and the men and women stubborn enough to trust physics over opinion. Subscribe right now, because every single week we bring you a technique like this one, field-tested across generations, buried in local records and oral histories, and more relevant today than any modern thermostat. Hit the bell, leave a comment below, and tell us where you're watching from, because what you're about to see might change how you think about the walls around you right now. His name was Callum Drayest. He had come to the Bitterroot Valley from Pembrokeshire, Wales in 1871, not as a romantic adventurer chasing frontier mythology, but as a practical man running from a flooded coal mine and a wage that couldn't keep a family fed. He was a stonemason by trade, trained since boyhood to read stone the way a carpenter reads grain, for weakness, for weight, for what it could bear and what it would give back. He had built walls in Wales that were still standing a century after the men who commissioned them were forgotten. He understood, in the marrow of his hands, that stone was not merely a building material. It was a battery. By 1879, Callum had spent 8 winters in the valley. 8 winters inside a standard square log cabin, the same design that every settler from Missouri to Manitoba was building in those years. One room for walls, a stone or clay hearth pushed against the north wall to keep the fire away from the sleeping area, a single chimney drawing upward through a gap in the roof. Simple, proven, and as Callum had spent 8 years quietly calculating, profoundly wasteful. The problem with a square cabin and a wall-mounted hearth was a problem of geometry and physics combined. The fire burned against one flat surface and pushed heat in a single direction, outward from the north wall toward the opposite side of the room. The 3 remaining walls received almost nothing directly from the fire. They radiated cold inward all night long, turning the corners of the room into pockets of dead, freezing air that no amount of stoking could fully overcome. A family in a standard cabin of that era, roughly 16 by 18 feet, might burn between 4 and 6 cords of firewood between November and March just to keep the interior above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Celsius on the coldest nights. And even then, the floor stayed cold enough to crack bare feet, and the far wall sometimes grew a thin rind of interior frost by morning. Callum had measured this, informally but consistently, using a small mercury thermometer he'd brought from Wales and kept hanging at 3 different heights inside his cabin across multiple winters. The disparity was not subtle. At chest height near the hearth, 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 degrees Celsius. At floor level in the far corner, sometimes as low as 31 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 0.5 degrees Celsius. Nearly freezing, inside a heated structure, while the fire was actively burning. He had told people about this, shown them his numbers. Most had nodded politely and changed the subject, the way people do when someone describes a problem they've decided to accept. But in the spring of 1879, after his youngest daughter spent 3 weeks sick in bed for what the traveling physician called persistent cold inflammation of the chest, Callum Dreas stopped accepting it. He walked out onto his land, paced a circle in the snow, and began sketching something in the dirt with the tip of his boot. Not a square, not a rectangle, 8 sides. The idea did not come from nowhere. Callum had seen octagonal structures before, not in Montana, but in the architectural journals that circulated among educated craftsmen in Wales and England during the 1860s. Orson Squire Fowler, the American phrenologist turned housing reformer, had published his influential treatise on octagon houses in 1848, arguing that the shape was more economical and better ventilated than the standard rectangle. But Fowler's octagon was a middle-class domestic fantasy. Wide porches, large windows, plaster walls. It had nothing to do with thermal survival in a Montana winter. What Callum was designing was something different, something that Fowler had never considered and that the frontier had never seen. An octagon built entirely from dry-stacked and mortared sandstone, with walls 22 inches thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the window sills, and a central firebox of dressed granite positioned at the exact geometric center of the floor plan. The thermal logic was straightforward, though it required thinking about heat the way a stonemason thinks about weight, as a force that travels, accumulates, and can be directed. A square room has 4 corners. Each corner is a structural dead zone where 2 cold wall surfaces meet, trapping a column of stagnant air that resists warming. In a 16-foot square room, those 4 corners represent a significant fraction of the total wall perimeter, and they receive almost no direct radiant heat from a wall-mounted hearth. An octagon eliminates the sharp 90-degree corner entirely. Its 8 interior angles, each at 135 degrees, are shallow enough that warm air circulating from a central fire reaches them without stagnating. The geometry forces even heat distribution in a way that a square room physically cannot achieve with a single heat source. But the geometry was only half of Callum's design. The other half was mass. A standard log wall of the period, 8 to 10 inches of pine or fir, has relatively low thermal mass. It heats quickly when the fire is burning and cools quickly when it dies. It offers almost no stored warmth. A 22-inch sandstone wall, by contrast, absorbs heat slowly during the hours when the fire burns hot, stores it deep within the stone, and releases it gradually, for hours after the fire has gone to coals and ash. Sandstone, common throughout the Bitterroot Valley and surface outcroppings, has a specific heat capacity that allows a wall of that thickness to continue warming the interior of a room for between 6 and 10 hours after the fire source is removed. Callum knew this not from textbooks, but from 8 years of laying his hands against stone walls in all conditions and learning what they gave back. The central firebox, a squared granite core approximately 36 inches on each face, with a single firebox opening and a flue rising through the roof at the dead center of the structure, was the keystone of the entire system. Positioned at the center, it radiated heat in all 8 directions simultaneously. Every wall received roughly equal thermal energy. No corner was favored. No wall ran cold. The flue, rising straight through the apex of the roof rather than angling through a wall, created a cleaner draft and reduced the risk of chimney fire in the upper structure. It was, in the language of modern building science, a passive thermal battery, charged by burning wood, discharged slowly through stone mass, distributed evenly by geometry. In the language of the Bitterroot Valley in 1879, it was the strangest thing anyone had ever tried to live in. The master carpenter of Stevensville, a Missouri-born man named Arden Falk, who had built more cabins in the valley than he could count, walked up to the construction site in late August with his thumbs in his suspenders and studied the rising walls for a long, silent moment. 8 walls, he finally said. 8 corners to seal. 8 angles to cut stone for, 8 walls to lose heat through instead of 4. He spat into the dirt. That's not a cabin, Dreist. That's a mistake with 8 walls. Arden Falk was not the only one. In a frontier valley community of the 1870s, A man's cabin was not merely his shelter, it was his statement of competence. The ability to build a sound, weatherproof structure was one of the most fundamental proofs a settler could offer that he belonged in the country, that he understood it, that he was serious about staying. A badly designed cabin wasn't just a cold house. It was a public embarrassment. And an octagonal stone cabin in the middle of the Bitterroot Valley, being raised by a Welsh stonemason who kept talking about heat acting like water, finding its level. Well, that was the kind of thing that got talked about at the Trading Post. The criticism came in two registers, the technical and the social, and both were delivered freely. On the technical side, the objections were numerous, and to anyone who hadn't thought carefully about mass and geometry, entirely reasonable. The sharp angles of the octagon's stone-cutting requirement were cited as a structural weakness. Every cut face is a place for frost to enter, argued one neighbor, a Norwegian immigrant named Breck who had spent 2 winters mortaring cracks in his own log walls. The central flue position struck several men as a fire hazard, since a chimney fire in a centrally located stack could not be easily reached from outside the structure to be doused. The depth of the walls, 22 inches at a time when most men built 8-inch log walls, was described as wasteful, both of material and of interior floor space. He's building a root cellar and calling it a house, was one assessment that circulated widely enough that Callum heard it repeated back to him by his own children. On the social side, the criticism cut a different way. Frontier masculinity in that era carried specific aesthetic expectations. A cabin should look like a cabin. For walls, a door, 2 windows, a pitched roof, a chimney on the end. It was a form that communicated permanence, normalcy, and a certain sturdy simplicity. Callum's octagon looked like none of those things. It looked foreign, willfully peculiar. Several neighbors let it be known, in the indirect way of rural communities, that they consider the design not just impractical, but somehow unserious. As if a man who couldn't build a normal square cabin was a man who hadn't fully committed to the country he'd chosen to live in. "That's not a house," said Arden Falk again, at the Trading Post, loud enough for 6 men to hear. "That's a Welshman trying to be clever about something that doesn't need cleverness." Callum heard that one too. He nodded, went back to his site, and kept laying stone. By October, the walls were at full height, 8 feet of dressed and mortared sandstone, pale gray and amber in the autumn light, punctuated by 4 small windows positioned on alternating faces of the octagon to allow cross-ventilation in summer while minimizing heat loss openings in winter. The central granite firebox was set and cured. The roof, a shallow cone of timber and sod, insulated with 6 inches of dried grass beneath the outer layer, was sealed before the first snow fell. When Callum lit the first fire in the central hearth on the 1st of November, the smoke rose straight through the flue and vanished into a clear, cold sky without a single eddy back into the room. He sat in the center of the stone floor, which was already beginning to hold warmth, and watched the 8 walls absorb the heat and hold it. He waited. The cold came on the 14th of December, and it did not announce itself gradually. Local account from Stevensville and the surrounding homesteads describe a temperature drop of nearly 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 22 degrees Celsius, in less than 18 hours, from a relatively mild 28 degrees Fahrenheit -2 degrees Celsius at midday to a brutal -14 degrees Fahrenheit -26 degrees Celsius by the following dawn. The wind off the sapphires arrived simultaneously, a sustained northwest blow that oral histories from the valley describe as cutting through log walls like they were canvas. Within 48 hours, the temperature had dropped further, settling into a range between -18 degrees Fahrenheit and -22 degrees Fahrenheit, -28 degrees Celsius to -30 degrees Celsius, that would persist, with little relief, for 19 consecutive days. This was not an ordinary winter cold snap. This was the kind of sustained, deep cold that the Bitterroot Valley had not experienced in a generation. The kind that killed livestock in their stalls, that froze well solid to a depth of 3 feet, that turned the river ice thick enough to drive a loaded wagon across. Homesteaders who had budgeted for a hard winter found themselves burning through their cordwood reserves at a rate they hadn't anticipated, and by the end of the first week, Several families in the valley were cutting green timber, wet, resin-heavy wood that burned poorly, smoked heavily, and gave back a fraction of the heat of properly seasoned fuel. In the standard square log cabins along the valley floor, the structural weaknesses that Callum Dreist had spent years quietly measuring were now on full and undeniable display. The corners, those 90-degree intersections of two cold log walls, became columns of unheatable air. Families pushed their beds toward the center of the room, away from the walls. Children slept in their coats. Several households reported interior temperatures, measured at sleeping height, dropping to between 34 degrees Fahrenheit and 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius to 3 degrees Celsius, during the pre-dawn hours, even with fires burning through the night. That is barely above freezing. In a house with a fire burning, Arden Falk, the master carpenter, burned through 2 full cords of firewood in the first 10 days alone, nearly a quarter of his entire winter supply, and still reported that the far wall of his cabin, 14 feet from the hearth, was cold enough to show condensation freezing on the inner surface. On the ridge above the valley, Callum Dreist fed his central hearth twice a day. He was burning roughly half a cord of seasoned ponderosa per week. His walls, 22 inches of sandstone that had been absorbing heat since November, were performing exactly as he had calculated. The fire would burn down to deep coals by midnight, and the walls would continue releasing stored heat until well past 4 in the morning, maintaining a livable temperature without any active fire at all. By the time he added wood at dawn, the interior of the Octagon had not dropped below 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius. Even on the nights when the outside temperature touched minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees Celsius. The stone was doing what stone does. Holding, giving back, slowly, steadily, without drama. Stay with me, because what happened when Callum's neighbors finally came up to that ridge and put a thermometer inside his walls is the number that changed the conversation in the entire valley. Don't go anywhere. Subscribe if you haven't yet. This is the kind of detail that most history books decided wasn't worth keeping, and we refused to let it disappear. It was Breck who went up first, the Norwegian immigrant, the same man who had warned, back in August, that every cut stone face was an invitation for frost, had spent the first 2 weeks of the cold snap burning green timber he'd cut from the hillside behind his cabin. His hearth was consuming wood at a rate that frightened him. On the morning of December 28th, with temperatures still sitting at minus 19 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius, and his cordwood stack diminished by more than half, he pulled on his coat, tucked his mercury thermometer into his breast pocket, and walked the half-mile up the ridge to Callum Dreist Octagon. He later told his wife that he had gone up there expecting to find Callum in trouble. Instead, he found him eating breakfast. Breck stepped through the low timber door into the interior of the Octagon and stopped. The warmth hit him the way warmth hits a man who has been cold for 2 weeks. Not like stepping near fire, but like stepping into a different season. The hearth was burning at a modest pace, a slow, dense fire of seasoned ponderosa, nothing like the roaring blaze Breck had been maintaining in his own cabin just to keep his family from sleeping in their coats. He pulled out his thermometer. He held it at chest height in the center of the room, away from the fire. He waited. The mercury settled at 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius. He walked to the far wall, the wall directly opposite the hearth opening, the position in his own cabin where the interior frost formed overnight. He pressed his palm flat against the sandstone. It was warm, not hot, not merely not cold, warm. The stone had been absorbing heat for 57 days, and it was giving it back with the unhurried generosity of something that had been storing it for exactly this purpose. He measured at the floor. 49 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 degrees Celsius. He stood in the corner, one of those shallow 135-degree octagon angles that Arden Falk had called structural foolishness, and held his thermometer still. 51 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius. Outside at that moment, it was minus 19 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius. The differential between the exterior temperature and Callum's interior floor corner was 70 degrees Fahrenheit. 70 degrees of separation, maintained by stone walls and geometry, with a fire burning at less than half the intensity Breck was using in his own cabin down the hill. Breck wrote those numbers down on the back of a letter he had in his coat pocket. He kept that letter for the rest of his life. The comparison, when it was assembled over the following days from the accounts of several Valley residents who visited the Octagon that week, was stark and specific. Callum's interior air temperature at sleeping height during the coldest nights of the event, between 52 degrees Fahrenheit and 56 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius to 13 degrees Celsius. The average reported interior temperature of the standard square log cabins in the valley during the same period, between 27 degrees Fahrenheit and 32 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 3 degrees Celsius to 0 degrees Celsius, at or below freezing inside heated structures. The gap was not marginal. It was not a matter of interpretation. It was 27 degrees Fahrenheit of measured, repeatable difference, sustained across 19 consecutive nights. On firewood, Callum burned approximately 2.1 cords of seasoned ponderosa between November 1st and March 15th. His nearest neighbors in equivalent-sized cabins, roughly 280 square feet of interior floor space, burned between 4.5 and 6 cords over the same period. Callum was heating the same Montana winter with, at best, half the fuel. The wall temperatures told the rest of the story. 6 hours after Callum banked his fire for the night, coals only, no active flame, the sandstone walls were still registering surface temperatures of 68 degrees Fahrenheit to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius to 22 degrees Celsius on the interior face. They were functioning as a slow-release radiator, continuing to warm the space through the coldest hours of the pre-dawn without consuming a single additional piece of wood. In a standard log cabin, the walls reached ambient exterior temperature within 2 hours of the fire dying down. In Callum's Octagon, the thermal lag, the delay between the fire going cold and the walls going cold, was between 6 and 9 hours. That was the difference between a family sleeping in coats and a family sleeping in blankets. The physics were not mysterious. They were not magic. They were the straightforward consequence of thermal mass. The simple, ancient principle that dense, heavy materials absorb heat slowly and release it slowly, acting as a buffer against temperature swings that lightweight materials cannot provide. A 22-inch sandstone wall, fully saturated with 50 days of twice-daily fires, had accumulated a thermal reserve that no log wall of any thickness could match. The octagon geometry had ensured that reserve was distributed evenly to every corner of the interior, eliminating the cold air pockets that plagued every square cabin in the valley. Callum Dreist had not discovered these principles. He had simply refused to ignore them. The first sign that something had shifted came in January. Arden Falk did not come up the ridge all at once, the way Breck had. He came in stages, the way proud men come to reconsider things they've said publicly. First, he sent his eldest son up on an errand, a question about stone-cutting tools, nothing to do with the cabin, of course. The boy came back and reported, matter-of-factly, that Mr. Dreist's house was real warm in there, pa warmer than ours. Falk said nothing. A week later, Falk himself appeared at the edge of Callum's property on the pretense of checking the fence line that ran along the ridge. He stood in the cold for a long moment, watching the thin, steady thread of smoke rising from the central flue. Not the billowing, desperate smoke of a fire being pushed hard. A thin, controlled thread. The smoke of a man who was not fighting his house. He knocked on the door. Callum let him in without ceremony, poured him coffee, and said nothing about the summer's remarks. Falk sat in the center of the room, felt the warmth coming from all 8 directions simultaneously. Not the scorching nearness of a wall hearth, but the even, enveloping warmth of a room whose walls were themselves the radiators, and was quiet for a long time. "How thick did you run the walls?" he finally asked. 22 inches at the base, Callum said. 18 at the window frames. Falk nodded slowly. He set his coffee down and turned to look at the nearest wall. Pale sandstone, dry, the mortar joints tight and clean. He pressed his knuckles against it, the way a carpenter checks timber for rot. It gave back warmth. "I want to understand the firebox position," he said. "I can show you the drawings," Callum said. That conversation lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, Falk had stopped being a skeptic and started being a student. He was not alone for long. The winter of 1879 to 1880 had the particular cruelty of proving its point repeatedly. Cold snap after cold snap rolling down from the sapphires through January and into February, each one finding the standard cabins of the valley unprepared in the same ways, losing heat through the same corners, burning through the same reserves of wood. And each time, Callum's Octagon sat on its ridge and held. Word moved through the valley the way practical information moves through frontier communities, not through announcements or arguments, but through observation and quiet copying. A homesteader named Odell Harp, who had a stone foundation already laid for a new outbuilding, altered his plans before pouring the full structure and incorporated a partial octagon form on the cold north end, with a 14-inch sandstone wall mass behind his secondary hearth. He reported, in an account preserved in a letter to his brother in Illinois, that the change made more difference than I'd credit to any single thing I've done on this property. A family named Pruitt, 2 miles south, rebuilt their collapsed root cellar with 16-inch limestone walls and a domed entry vestibule that Callum helped them design. A thermal buffer between the outside air and the cellar interior that kept their winter vegetable stores from freezing during the January cold snaps. Their carrots and turnips came through the winter without a single loss. By the end of the winter of 1880 to 1881, local accounts from the Stevensville area suggest that at least 11 homesteads within a 40-mile radius had incorporated some element of Callum's approach into new construction or renovation. Thicker stone walls, central or near-central hearth placement, reduced corner angles in masonry structures, or the use of sandstone thermal mass behind conventional log walls as a backing layer. None of them built a precise duplicate of the octagon, but all of them had taken something from it. The understanding that geometry and mass were not aesthetic choices but thermal engineering decisions, and that the people who treated them as such stayed warm for less wood. Arden Falk, for his part, never publicly recanted his summer remarks. But in the spring of 1881, he began recommending to clients who asked about new cabin construction that they speak with a Welsh stonemason on the East Ridge before finalizing their plans. It was, for a man of his reputation and his prior public position, as close to an apology as the frontier offered. Callum Dreist accepted it in the spirit it was given. He was already drawing plans for a second octagon, larger this time, with a sleeping loft and a secondary thermal wall on the northwest face, the direction for which the worst of the sapphire winds descended. He had learned things from the first winter in the structure that no drawing could have taught him. Where the cold pressed hardest, which wall face needed the most mass, how the central flue behaved in different wind conditions. The cabin had taught him as much as he had taught it. That is the nature of building in a real climate, for real stakes, without the luxury of being wrong twice. There is a question worth sitting with. Callum Dreist was not a physicist. He had no laboratory, no academic training in thermodynamics, no access to the scientific literature on heat transfer that was being written in European universities during those same decades. He was a stonemason from Pembrokeshire who had spent his working life learning what stone does, how it bears weight, how it weathers, and, as it turned out, how it holds heat. What he understood, through practice rather than theory, was something that the standard cabin-building consensus of his era had completely abandoned in the name of simplicity and speed, that a building is not just a container for warmth, but a participant in producing it. That the materials of the walls, the geometry of the plan, and the position of the heat source are not independent decisions, but a single, integrated thermal system. And that getting that system right means the difference between a house that fights winter and a house that outlasts it. The square log cabin was fast to build. It required no special cutting, no heavy lifting of dressed stone, no careful calculation of wall thickness or firebox placement. It was the frontier standard because the frontier rewarded speed and punished complexity. But speed has a cost, and in a Montana winter, that cost was measured in cords of wood, in sleepless nights feeding fires that couldn't keep up, in children who went to sleep cold and woke up colder. Callum's Octagon took longer to build. It required more skill, more material, more thought. But across the 19 coldest days of 1879, It outperformed every standard cabin in the valley by a margin that no one who experienced it could explain away. Not 3 or 4 degrees warmer, 27 degrees warmer, at half the fuel. This is not the story of a genius. It is the story of a man who paid attention to a problem that everyone else had decided to accept, who applied knowledge that had existed for centuries in the stone-building traditions of Wales and Scotland and the Anatolian Highlands and the Norse Longhouse, and who refused to let the mockery of his neighbors substitute for the evidence of his own thermometer. The Octagon cabin stood on the east ridge of the Bitterroot Valley for at least 30 years after Callum built it, according to land records from the area. It outlasted the log cabins built the same year by the same neighbors who laughed at it. It outlasted Arden Fox Doubts. It outlasted the winter of 1879 and the winter after that and the one after that. Stone is patient. Heat is honest. Geometry does not care what you believe about it. The frontier settlers who figured this out, who understood that ancient building traditions existed not because people in the past lacked the imagination to do something different, but because they had already tried everything else and learned what worked. Those settlers stayed warm. They kept their families fed. They made it to spring with wood to spare and walls still standing. That is what Callum Dreist understood. That is what we keep losing every time we decide that old solutions are primitive solutions. They aren't. They are solutions that have already paid for themselves in the hardest currency there is: real cold, real stakes, and no room to be wrong. If you made it this far, thank you. Leave a comment below and tell us, where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever had to survive? And if there's a technique from the old builders you think deserves its own episode, tell us that too. We read every one. Subscribe if you haven't. Hit the bell. We'll see you next week. Educational note: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature, and it does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.